Welcome to Mighty Habits. I'm Steven.
And I'm Mary.
Today we're strapping on our economic scuba gear. We're diving deep into something called reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of fancy.
Yeah, it does. But it could, seriously change what you pay for stuff, groceries, gas, maybe even your next car.
Right. And it's been making headlines. So our mission today is basically to unpack this. What are reciprocal tariffs? Why are people talking about them now?
And what could happen, for you, for the economy? We've looked at the arguments for and against, trying to cut through the noise.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks, reciprocal tariffs. What are they, really?
Simply put, the idea is, well, whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. It's meant to be reciprocal, back and forth, a mirror image, basically.
So like trade tax tit for tat.
Mm.
If country A puts a 10% tariff on our cars, we put a 10% tariff on their cars.
Exactly. That's the core concept.
How's that different from, how tariffs usually work? Worked in the past.
Well, typically, tariff policies haven't been strictly mirrored like that. You have things like the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The U.S. is a member.
Right.
And the general principle there is more about offering your best rate, your lowest tariff for a product to all other WTO members. It's called most favored nation.
Ah, okay. So less country-specific retaliation, more of a general standard?
Generally, yes, though there are exceptions for, like, special free trade deals. But this reciprocal idea is much more direct, a specific, you do this to us, we do exactly that back to you approach.
Okay, so why the push for this now? What's the argument for it?
The main argument, particularly from former President Trump, who's championed this, is about leveling the playing field. It's about addressing what proponents see as unfair trade practices.
The idea that other countries charge us way higher tariffs than we charge them.
Precisely. The claim is that some nations slap, tremendously higher tariffs on U.S. goods, and the sentiment is that the U.S. has been, quote, ripped off for decades. So reciprocal tariffs are presented as a way to fix that alleged unfairness. They often point to industries like the U.S. auto industry, saying it's been hammered and hemorrhaging jobs, partly because of these tariff imbalances.
So the goal is to force other countries to lower their tariffs on U.S. stuff.
That's the hope, yeah. Either they lower theirs or they face the same high tariff coming back at them when they try to sell here.
It sounds kind of simple and fair on the surface, but I hear economists are less enthusiastic. What are their big worries?
Oh, yeah. The vast majority of economists agree that this kind of policy is likely going to hurt U.S. consumers. The main mechanism, rising prices.
Because companies importing goods will just pass those new tariff costs on to us.
Exactly. If it costs more to bring something into the country, that cost usually finds its way to the price tag you see in the store. And because this could affect so many different products from different countries,
the price hikes could add up across the board, not just on, like, steel or washing machines, but lots of things.
Correct. Think clothes, electronics, food items. It could be widespread. And beyond just higher prices, there's another concern. Less choice and maybe less reliability.
How so?
Well, if foreign companies suddenly face much higher tariffs to sell here, some might just decide, it's not worth the hassle or the cost. They might pull back from the U.S. market.
So fewer imported options on the shelves.
Potentially, yes. Which means less variety for consumers and possibly disruptions if U.S. companies rely on those specific imported goods or components.
So the economists are basically saying that fairness in trade is maybe a bit more complicated than just matching tariff numbers dollar for dollar.
That's a big part of it. They argue that trade involves way more than just tariffs. You've got regulations, subsidies, currency values, labor standards, a whole bunch of stuff. Focusing only on tariffs might be missing the bigger picture and could even backfire.
You mentioned the WTO earlier. How does this square with that? If the U.S. starts doing strict reciprocal tariffs, does that break WTO rules?
It certainly creates tension. The WTO framework is built on that non-discrimination principle, treating all members similarly. A purely reciprocal approach is inherently discriminatory. You're treating countries differently based only on their tariff rate for a specific good.
So it could lead to disputes? Challenges the WTO.
Very likely. And it undermines the WTO's underlying idea, which is that lower tariffs overall tend to benefit everyone in the global economy and individual countries. This reciprocal approach kind of goes against that grain.
Okay, let's talk trade deficits. That always comes up. The idea that we buy more than we sell. proponents of reciprocal tariffs often link them to fixing the deficit, right?
Yes, absolutely. The argument connects the tariff imbalance, like, say, China charging higher average tariffs on U.S. goods than we charge on theirs directly to the U.S. trade deficit. The thinking is, if they charge us more, it's harder for us to sell there, so we buy more from them than they buy from us.
Makes sense, intuitively. But what do most economists say about the deficit itself? Is it always bad?
Not necessarily. Many economists actually aren't overly worried about the trade deficit itself. They see it differently.
Oh.
Well, one view is that the deficit reflects strong demand for U.S. assets. Other countries want to invest here. They want dollars which are seen as safe. To get those dollars, they sell us goods. So the deficit is partly just a reflection of the dollar's global role.
Okay.
Another major factor economists point to is the U.S. federal budget deficit. When the government spends more than it takes in, it has to borrow money, often from abroad. That inflow of foreign capital has to be matched by a trade deficit. It's an accounting identity.
So the budget deficit forces us to borrow, and that borrowing shows up as a trade deficit.
Essentially, yes. So from this perspective, the trade deficit isn't primarily caused by unfair tariffs, but by things like our own spending habits and the global demand for dollars.
So economists mostly think trying to fix the trade deficit with tariffs is misguided.
Generally, yes. They see the trade deficit more as the U.S. borrowing from the rest of the world. Now, whether we're borrowing too much is a separate debate about consumption versus income, but they argue that bilateral tariffs aren't the right tool to address that.
Okay, say we do put higher reciprocal tariffs on imports. What happens to our exports? Do they just carry on as usual?
Probably not. This is a key point economists make. Higher tariffs usually hurt both imports and exports.
Wait, how do tariffs on imports hurt exports?
It's about the currency. When we import less, because tariffs make imports more expensive, fewer U.S. dollars flow out into the world market. Basic supply and demand means the dollars that are out there become more valuable. The dollar strengthens.
Okay.
And when the dollar is stronger, U.S. goods become more expensive for people in other countries to buy. So they buy fewer of our exports.
So we buy less from them, they buy less from us. It doesn't actually fix the trade balance.
Exactly. The deficit might stay roughly the same, but the total volume of trade, both imports and exports, shrinks. And less trade usually isn't seen as good for economic growth.
And what about companies just moving? If they face tariffs from, say, China, can't they just make the stuff somewhere else?
That's another huge factor. Supply chains are global and flexible. If tariffs make importing from country A too expensive, companies will absolutely look to source from country B or country C instead.
We saw that happen, right, with tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yes. For instance, some footwear and apparel companies shifted production from China to places like Vietnam to avoid those U.S. tariffs.
So the trade deficit with China might go down, but the deficit with Vietnam just goes up. It's like playing whack-a-mole.
That's a perfect analogy. You hit the deficit in one place and it pops up somewhere else because companies reroute their supply chains. It doesn't necessarily reduce the overall U.S. trade deficit.
Implementing this sounds incredibly complicated, just the logistics of it.
Oh, massively. Think about it. There are thousands and thousands of different tariff lines,
Right.
different categories of goods. And the U.S. trades with nearly 200 countries. You'd need a system to constantly track every tariff that every country charges on every U.S. product and then mirror that back. The administrative burden would be enormous.
It's not like reading off a simple menu.
Not even close. Tariff schedules are notoriously complex, full of specific details and variations. Just collecting the data, let alone applying it reciprocally and keeping it updated, would be a Herculean task.
Okay, there's also this idea of using reciprocity as industrial policy. What's that about?
The argument is that reciprocal tariffs aren't just about fairness, but could be a tool to strategically shape the U.S. economy, maybe protect certain industries or pressure others abroad.
But I heard a concern that it kind of lets other countries set our tariffs. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really interesting critique. Imagine another country, say, heavily protects its dairy industry with high tariffs, even though the U.S. is super competitive in dairy.
Yeah.
Under strict reciprocity, if that country refuses to lower its dairy tariffs, the U.S. would then be forced to impose equally high tariffs on dairy imports from that country, even if U.S. consumers and maybe even U.S. dairy processors would benefit from cheaper imports.
So we end up adopting their protectionist policy, even if it doesn't help us.
Potentially, yes. It means our tariff rate in that sector is effectively being set by the other country's protectionist choices. We lose some control over our own trade policy.
That seems counterproductive. And is the plan only to raise our tariffs to match others, or would we lower ours if another country's rate is lower?
That's a bit unclear. The rhetoric mostly focuses on raising U.S. tariffs to match higher foreign ones. And it gets even muddier. There's been talk of targeting things like the European Union's value-added tax, the VAT.
The VAT, that's like a sales tax, right? How is that like a tariff?
Well, the argument made by some proponents is that because VAT is applied to imports but not typically exports, it functions like a border tax or tariff. Most economists disagree strongly, saying VAT is a domestic consumption tax, not a trade barrier.
Treating a VAT like a tariff sounds like it would really stir things up with Europe.
Oh, absolutely. It would be highly contentious and could open up a whole new front in trade disputes, potentially leading to serious retaliation. It's mixing apples and oranges, many would argue.
So if the U.S. really goes down this road, what's the likely global reaction? A big trade war.
That's one distinct possibility, a sort of global free-for-all, where everyone starts raising tariffs in response, leading to a major slowdown in global trade, which hurts basically everyone.
Not great. Any other possibilities?
Another scenario some analysts foresee is that the rest of the world might actually coordinate against the U.S. They could see the U.S. approach as disruptive and harmful to their own economies and decide to strengthen trade ties among themselves, potentially isolating the U.S.
Wow. So either a global tariff mess or the U.S. being sidelined. Neither sounds ideal.
Not particularly, no. Both scenarios involve significant economic disruption and uncertainty.
And what about the timeline? If this policy were pursued, how quickly could it happen? And what's the bottom line economic outlook?
Implementing something this complex would likely take time. Experts estimate at least 6 months, maybe more, just to work out the details and set up the mechanisms.
Okay.
But the overriding worry among economists remains the impact on inflation and growth. The fear is that adding more tariffs, reciprocal or otherwise, will just push prices higher for consumers, worsening inflation.
And potentially slow down the economy, lead to a recession.
That's the concern. Higher costs, disrupted supply chains, potential retaliation from other countries. It all points towards a drag on economic activity. And ironically,
Yeah.
if the trade deficit does shrink under such policies, it might actually be a bad sign. It could mean the U.S. economy is weakening, so consumer and businesses are simply buying less overall, including fewer imports.
Right. A falling deficit caused by a shrinking economy isn't exactly a win.
Not at all. It's a symptom of broader problems.
Well, this has been a lot.
Mhm.
Reciprocal tariffs, definitely more complicated than they sound.
For sure. It touches so many things, from the price of a milk to, huge global economic structures. It's something we really need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely valuable info for anyone in business, anyone interested in economics, or frankly, anyone who buys things.
Yeah.
Which is everyone. Understanding how these policies might affect your wallet and the world is pretty crucial.
Couldn't agree more. It highlights how connected everything is. Trade policy isn't just some abstract thing. It hits home.
So if you found this useful, if you like getting into the weeds on these big, complex topics, make sure you follow or subscribe to Mighty Habits. We'll keep bringing you these deep dives.